So I want you to just picture the absolute, physical epicenter of American executive power.
Right, like the literal core of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But you aren't in the Oval Office. You're actually sitting in the back of the presidential limousine.
Oh, wow. The beast.
The beast, yeah. That heavily armored, rolling fortress. I mean, the doors are like 8 inches thick. The glass is this multi-layered, bulletproof stuff.
It's essentially a tank that looks like a Cadillac.
It really is. And the outside world, the sirens, the motorcade, the crowds, it's all completely muffled. You are just entirely alone in this hermetically sealed environment.
And you're in there with the commander-in-chief.
Exactly. Just you and the president.
Yeah.
And you're having this one-on-one conversation about a decision that could trigger like a massive, totally unpredictable geopolitical earthquake.
Because you're debating whether or not to launch devastating military strikes against a sovereign nation.
Right. That intense, just suffocatingly high-stakes scenario. That's exactly where we're starting today's deep dive.
It really is the ultimate fly-on-the-wall scenario. You just cannot get much closer to the raw machinery of global power than the backseat of the beast during an active ticking clock national security crisis.
And the person sitting in that seat, the one actively advising the president to strike, is sitting U.S. Senator Ted Cruz.
Yeah, which is fascinating.
It is. So today our mission is to unpack his incredibly complex, highly specific worldview on foreign policy and national security. We're going to really break down his unique criteria for when the American military should actually deploy.
Right. His specific rules of engagement, basically.
Exactly. Along with his views on the lifespan of global regimes and these deeply unsettling warnings he has about the invisible future of modern warfare.
And to do this, we're analyzing this massive, totally unfiltered, long-form interview the senator gave recently.
Yeah, on the trigonometry.
Right, exactly. And it's such a fascinating primary document because it bypasses the usual, 30-second cable news talking points.
Oh, completely. It goes way deeper.
Yeah, it delves into the underlying psychology of nuclear deterrence, the literal economic pipelines that keep dictatorships afloat, and even the severe internal fractures happening right now within American domestic politics.
Now, before we really step into this arena, let's just lay our cards on the table for you, the listener.
Yeah, we definitely need to do that.
We're looking at the worldview of a sitting, highly polarizing politician, right? The ideas we're unpacking today touch the absolute third rails of both left-wing and right-wing politics.
They absolutely do.
So to be completely clear to you listening, we are not taking sides, nor are we endorsing any of the political viewpoints, policy decisions, or critiques mentioned.
Right. That is crucial. Our job is strictly to impartially report on the factual content provided in the source material.
Exactly. We're just here to help you understand the specific arguments and ideas being presented. Think of us as, like, your impartial forensic team.
I like that analogy. We're examining the architecture of a belief system. We just want to understand the why and the how behind these geopolitical calculations without adopting them as our own.
Right. So prepare yourself for a journey that is going to pull us from the humid, dangerous jungles of the 1950s Cuban Revolution all the way to the chilling, sterile laboratories of the future.
Where genetically targeted bioweapons are being conceptualized, it gets pretty dark.
It really does. But to understand how any leader forms their criteria for war and peace, you first have to look at their foundational experiences, right?
You're to find their crucible.
Yes, their crucible. And for Cruz, that crucible is intimately, permanently tied to the Cuban Revolution.
Which is wild, because this isn't like theoretical political science for him.
Yeah.
It's visceral family history.
Right.
I mean, his father actually grew up in Cuba and at the incredibly young age of 14 began fighting in the Cuban Revolution alongside Fidel Castro.
14 years old. Just imagine a 14-year-old doing that. And the crucial context here is that in the 1950s, Fulgencio Batista was the dictator of Cuba.
And Batista's regime was notoriously corrupt.
Oh, incredibly corrupt. Oppressive and heavily intertwined with the American mafia. So you have this 14-year-old kid who just sees a corrupt dictator and wants him out.
All right, he didn't know Fidel Castro was a communist at that point.
No, exactly. Castro wasn't broadcasting a Marxist-Leninist agenda to the peasants and the teenagers back then. He was framing himself as, like, a populist liberator.
Yeah, a freedom fighter.
Right. Cruz actually jokes in the interview that when he wants to irritate his dad today, he calls him a communist guerrilla.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and his dad gets furious and insists he was never a communist, just a teenager caught up in a violent revolution.
But that involvement had Brutal physical consequences for his father, right?
Yeah, it really did. When his dad was 17, he was captured by Batista's forces. He was thrown in a military jail, severely beaten, and tortured. His family realized he was going to be executed, so they literally managed to bribe his way out.
And then he fled the country, right?
Yeah, he managed to get a student visa to the University of Texas. He took a ferry to Key West, a Greyhound bus to Austin, and arrived with literally $100 stuffed into his underwear.
Just $100.
Yep. He didn't speak English and started his American life washing dishes for 50 cents an hour.
I mean, it is the ultimate hardscrabble American dream narrative, but forged in the literal fire of a revolution.
Exactly. But here's the thing, that is only half of the family's story.
Right. There's Aunt Sonia.
Yes. The other half is what creates the true ideological cement for his worldview. Cruz's Aunt Sonia, his father's younger sister, she stayed in Cuba after the revolution succeeded.
And she watched as Fidel Castro took power, dropped the whole Populist Liberator Act, and actually declared himself a communist.
Right, and he starts seizing private land, shutting down the press, executing dissidents. And Sonia realizes that as bad as Batista was, Castro is actually worse.
So what did she do?
She joins the counter-revolution. She starts fighting against Castro's new communist regime.
Wow. And the tragic parallel here is that she, too, was discovered, imprisoned, and tortured.
Yeah. But this time by Castro's intelligence officers.
So within one single historical event, you have a father who was tortured by a right-wing, mafia-backed dictator and an aunt who was tortured by a left-wing communist dictator.
It's unbelievable. And Cruz describes his childhood as sitting at the feet of these two freedom fighters who fought on opposite sides of the exact same revolution.
That has to shape you.
Oh, completely. He says if you asked him at 5 or 6 years old what he wanted to do with his life, he would have said, I want to fight for freedom.
And this dual trauma family history leads him to an absolute unyielding hatred of communism.
Absolute hatred. He calls it the most evil, twisted, depraved ideology mankind has ever produced. He says it's responsible for more murder, torture, and human misery than any other system of government.
Which completely illuminates his current political posture in Washington.
Yeah, it really does.
He views the U.S. Senate not just as a legislative body for, passing tax codes and highway bills. He calls it a modern-day coliseum.
A coliseum. He literally describes his daily job as strapping on armor to go fight the barbarians.
Mm-hmm.
But okay, let's unpack this for a second. If you are treating the Senate floor and international relations like a literal gladiator arena, aren't you entirely blinding yourself to diplomacy?
That's a really fair question.
Right. I mean, if every foreign leader who doesn't align with American values is just a barbarian to be slain, you're essentially guaranteeing endless conflict. You're wearing armor, which means you're expecting a fight, not a negotiation. Doesn't that make every single adversary look exactly like Fidel Castro?
Well, that is the pivotal question of his entire worldview. And the answer is that for Cruz, when dealing with certain autocratic regimes, nuance is not just unnecessary. He views it as actively dangerous.
Wow, actively dangerous.
Yeah. This personal history creates a binary, absolutist framework regarding autocracies. Communism and dictatorships are not abstract political theories to be debated in, like a university seminar.
Right, they're not just ideas.
Exactly. They are tangible historical forces of torture and poverty that his own family literally bled over.
Which explains his stark assertion that dictators like Castro and Vladimir Putin live like billionaires while their people suffer in absolute squalor.
Exactly. He frames his entire approach to foreign policy around the moral imperative of defeating these kinds of regimes.
Defeating communism and autocracy is the antithesis of everything he values, right? Human liberty, free enterprise, individual freedom. It is a battle of good versus evil.
Right.
So if his hatred for these dictators is absolute, logic kind of dictates he'd want the U.S. military to march around the globe overthrowing all of them.
You'd think so, yeah.
Yet he vehemently opposed the Iraq War. He opposed intervening in Libya. That apparent contradiction forces us to really look at the actual mathematical formula he uses to justify war.
This is where his philosophy becomes highly structured. It's almost like an algorithm.
An algorithm? How so?
Well, he explicitly rejects the traditional bipolar view of American foreign policy. He argues you're usually presented with a false dichotomy.
Okay, what are the two sides of that dichotomy?
Basically, you are either an interventionist who wants to invade everywhere to spread democracy, like the late John McCain,
Right.
or you are an isolationist who wants to withdraw entirely from the world stage and pull up the drawbridge, like Rand Paul.
Okay. And he argues both of those extremes are flawed. He says most Americans don't want to police the world, but they also know we can't just ignore it.
Exactly. So he defines himself as a third point on the triangle. He calls it being a non-interventionist hawk.
Non-interventionist Hawk. I mean, it sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it?
It does, but he provides a very specific formula for it.
Okay, what's the formula?
The single overriding touchstone for this philosophy is a simple question. Does this specific military action protect the vital national security interests of the United States?
And that's it. That's the only metric.
That is the only metric.
So no sending American troops to die for nation building, no deploying the military to, quote, promote democracy in countries that have no history of it.
Right. In fact, he specifically mocks the phrase used during the Obama administration about using military force to defend norms.
Oh, right.
He says he doesn't even know what that means, but he certainly isn't going to risk the lives of 19-year-old Marines for a norm.
Yeah, he's definitely not interested in trying to turn fractured countries in the Middle East into Switzerland.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
And to understand how this formula works in practice, we have to look at the mechanics of past conflicts. He explicitly condemns the wars in Iraq and Libya.
Now, wait. He acknowledges that Saddam Hussein and Muammar Gaddafi were monsters who murdered their own people, right?
Oh, absolutely. But, and this is the crucial variable in his calculus, they were also brutalizing and killing radical Islamic terrorists within their own borders.
Ah, so they kept a lid on extremism through sheer authoritarian terror.
Exactly. And when we came in, we toppled Saddam, we toppled Gaddafi, and we created massive countrywide power vacuums.
And who filled those vacuums? ISIS? Al-Qaeda offshoots.
Right. Terrorists who then turned around and started killing Americans and destabilizing the entire region.
Therefore, by his touchstone metric, those wars were a material harm to our national security. We removed a bad guy, but we replaced him with chaos that actively hunted Americans.
That's exactly his argument, and he applies this exact same rigid standard to Syria.
Oh, the Syria situation is fascinating under this lens. He details his intense opposition to President Obama's proposed military strikes against Bashar al-Assad.
Because Assad had crossed that heavily publicized red line by using chemical weapons against his own civilian population.
Right. And by any moral standard, it was a horrific atrocity. But Cruz listened to the administration's arguments for intervention and asked a very specific mechanical question.
What was it?
He said, look, there are 7 major rebel groups fighting Assad in Syria, and many of them are affiliated with radical Islamic terrorists. If we bomb Assad and topple his government, how do we stop al-Qaeda from raiding his armories and getting those chemical weapons?
Wow. And what was the administration's answer?
He argues their answers were totally incoherent. They talked about launching an unbelievably small attack, which he felt had zero strategic purpose and would just project weakness.
So his cold calculation was basically, as evil as Assad is, he isn't using chemical weapons on American citizens.
Exactly. Al-Qaeda, on the other hand, would love nothing more than to smuggle sarin gas into a Western city. So, intervening to stop a domestic atrocity risked handing weapons of mass destruction to people who want to kill us. But listen to the implications of this. If the absolute only metric is American lives or American security, doesn't this essentially give a massive flashing green light to global dictators?
That's the heavy critique, yeah.
Right. Doesn't this framework basically broadcast to the world, hey, you can commit horrific, unspeakable atrocities against your own civilian population, you can use chemical weapons, run concentration camps, and as long as you don't touch a single U.S. citizen, the non-interventionist hawk will leave you alone.
It's a deeply uncomfortable moral position for a lot of people.
It almost sounds isolationist.
Well, it is a profoundly pragmatic, unsentimental calculus. It inherently accepts a certain level of global tragedy, but within his framework, the U.S. military is not a global police force tasked with enforcing human rights.
It's just a shield.
Exactly. A shield designed strictly to protect American citizens. He equates this philosophy to Ronald Reagan's concept of peace through strength.
Right, the idea that you don't invade everyone. I mean, he notes Reagan's biggest military deployment was just the tiny island of Grenada.
But you build a military so overwhelmingly lethal that your enemies are terrified to ever cross your boundaries.
He compares this approach directly to Donald Trump's foreign policy, actually. He argues Trump instinctively followed this exact same non-interventionist hawk model.
Yeah, he argues that under Trump, foreign adversaries genuinely believed the commander-in-chief might be unpredictable or aggressive enough to obliterate them.
Which created a deterrence that maintained peace. And he contrasts this with what he views as appeasement, arguing that trying to placate dictators only encourages them.
Right, he actually jokes that nobody gets a degree from the Neville Chamberlain School of Foreign Affairs.
Because trying to buy off a bully has never worked in human history.
Right. But if the rule book is so incredibly strict, you know, no nation building, no defending norms, only act when American lives are directly threatened, what does it actually take to trigger the full force of the American military in this worldview?
Well, that brings us right back to the backseat of the beast. The ultimate test of this non-interventionist Hawk framework, the decision to launch military strikes against the Islamic Republic of Iran.
The limo ride.
The limo ride. Cruz is sitting with Trump the day before the U.S. launched significant targeted military strikes against Iran. Trump is soliciting his advice.
And Cruz's response is completely unequivocal. He says, I think we should not miss this moment. America will be much, much safer. I believe we have an opportunity if we can collapse this regime. There are very few things on planet Earth that would improve American national security as much.
Collapse the regime. I mean, that is not a small border skirmish. That is the dismantling of a sovereign government.
Yeah. And Trump asks him, should we negotiate further?
And Cruz says absolutely not. He views the regime as fundamentalist liars who only use negotiations to buy time to rebuild their weapons programs.
So what does he suggest instead?
He tells Trump the only diplomatic off-ramp to offer the Ayatollah is the Maduro deal.
Oh, right. Let's explain the mechanics of the Maduro deal.
Yeah, please do.
It refers to an offer the U.S. supposedly made to Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. It is essentially offering a dictator a golden parachute.
Okay, what are the terms?
The terms are step down, go into exile, take your family and some wealth, and you'll be allowed to live out your days on a beach somewhere in peace.
And if you say no, which, Maduro did.
If you say no, the alternative is that the U.S. military or your own starving populace will eventually ensure your end is less than pleasant.
Less than pleasant, right. And Cruz suggests offering the Ayatollah and the ruling clerics in Iran that exact same stark choice. Leave or face annihilation.
What's crucial to understand here is the massive disconnect between the stated goals of the U.S. military apparatus and Cruz's personal goals.
Yeah, this is a huge distinction. The administration publicly stated their objective for these strikes was strictly to degrade Iran's military capacity so they couldn't launch attacks in the region.
And Cruz details how surgically successful that was over a 2.5-week period. Right?
Unbelievably successful. The U.S. essentially eliminated their air defense radar systems, wiped out their short and medium-range missile launchers, systematically destroyed their drone manufacturing facilities.
They crippled the Iranian Navy.
Yeah, and decapitated the leadership of the regime and the IRGC.
Just for context for you listening, the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, is not the regular Iranian army.
Wait, really? It's separate?
Yeah, it is a massive, elite paramilitary organization. It actually controls vast sectors of the Iranian economy, and it is specifically tasked with exporting the Islamic Revolution abroad.
Primarily by funding and training terrorist proxy groups.
Exactly. So decapitating their leadership is a massive blow to their operational capacity.
But here is the distinction we mentioned. The administration bent over backwards to avoid the phrase regime change.
And Cruz openly admits why.
Right, because after the 20-year quagmire of the Iraq War, the phrase regime change is politically toxic to the American public.
But Cruz unapologetically states that his personal objective is unequivocally collapsing the Iranian regime.
So the question is, why does Iran pass his strict test for war when Iraq and Libya failed it?
He lays out a meticulously documented list of grievances for that. He argues Iran has essentially been at war with the United States for 47 years.
Going all the way back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution.
Right, when they stormed the U.S. Embassy and held Americans hostage for 444 days. And he identifies them as the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism today.
Providing the vast majority of the funding, training, and weapons to groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Houthis.
He notes they are responsible for the deaths of nearly 1,000 Americans over those decades, largely through advanced IEDs supplied to insurgents in Iraq.
And incredibly specifically, he points out that the Ayatollah actively hired hit squads to try and assassinate U.S. officials on American soil.
Including Donald Trump himself.
Right. So under his touchstone of, does this protect American lives, removing an Islamist government that actively chants death to America and actively funds operations that kill Americans.
It isn't nation building for him.
Exactly. It's a clear-cut urgent national security imperative.
But the mechanics of how you achieve that without a full-scale ground invasion are incredibly complex.
Yeah, how do you actually do it? The interviewer presses him on this, like, okay, if you don't want to send 100,000 Marines to occupy Tehran like we did in Baghdad, how does the regime actually fall?
And Cruz's strategy is to combine overwhelming military pressure from the outside, destroying their weapons, and the IRGC forces that oppress the population with arming the protesters on the inside.
He brings up a wild historical analogy to justify this.
The NRA ad.
Yes. He references a full-page ad the NRA ran shortly after the Tiananmen Square massacre in China. The ad showed a picture of the massive crowds of students in the square facing down the tanks.
And the caption was essentially, "Last week, over 1 million people rose up in protest. Imagine what would have happened if they had had guns."
Cruz argues that 1 million people rising up who are armed is no longer a protest, it's a revolution.
Right. He points out that the Iranian regime has murdered anywhere from 10,000 to 40,000 of its own citizens during recent protests.
Because they can. They can do that easily because the regime has heavy machine guns and the citizens have rocks. He wants to fundamentally alter that kinetic dynamic. But wait, injecting firearms into a civilian populace already being massacred is a massive escalation.
Huge escalation.
Is handing out assault rifles to untrained university students and shopkeepers really the spark for a neat democratic revolution? Or are you just guaranteeing an incredibly bloody, protracted, Syrian-style civil war?
It is an astronomical gamble. The entire strategy rests on the assumption that by using U.S. air power to surgically remove the regime's oppressive apparatus.
Taking out the IRGC leadership, destroying communication nodes.
Exactly. You weaken the state enough that the 92 million citizens of Iran can successfully overwhelm the remaining internal security forces.
And what happens after the dust settles? Like, if they actually overthrow the Ayatollah, what is the end goal? What replaces them?
Cruz's answer is shockingly blunt. He says he is largely agnostic as to who the people of Iran choose to govern them.
Agnostic.
Yeah. He mentions there are factions supporting the exiled Shah's son as an interim leader, but he says he doesn't really care. His singular focus is that whoever takes the reins of power is not actively trying to kill Americans.
That agnosticism is just the purest distillation of the non-interventionist hawk.
It's a total rejection of the famous Pottery Barn rule of foreign policy. The idea that if you break it, you buy it.
Right, which drove the U.S. to spend 2 decades trying to rebuild Iraq and Afghanistan.
Cruz is essentially arguing that if a foreign regime is actively hunting Americans, we have the moral and strategic right to smash it to pieces.
But we have absolutely zero obligation to sweep up the glass, rebuild their infrastructure, or manage their elections.
As long as the new tenant isn't hostile to us, yeah.
But the immediate ticking clock threat, the thing that accelerates all this military action and removes the luxury of waiting for an internal revolution, isn't just conventional terrorism.
No, it's the nuclear threshold.
And this brings us to a fascinating psychological assessment Cruz makes regarding the leadership in Tehran versus other nuclear states.
This deals with the foundational psychology of deterrence. Since the Soviet Union got the bomb, global security has relied on MAD, mutually assured destruction.
Right. Traditional nuclear deterrence is like 2 men standing in a pool of gasoline, each holding a lit match. Neither drops the match because they both want to live.
Exactly. The logic requires both sides to fundamentally value their own survival above all else.
And Cruz draws a stark, terrifying contrast between North Korea and Iran to illustrate why he thinks this logic completely fails with the Ayatollah.
Let's look at North Korea first. He acknowledges Kim Jong-un is a narcissistic, unstable megalomaniac.
I mean, North Korea has a nuclear arsenal and constantly threatens to turn American cities into a sea of fire.
But Cruz argues that with North Korea, traditional deterrence still holds.
Why?
Because the one absolute truth about Kim Jong-un is that he loves being the supreme leader. He loves the power, the palaces, the survival of his dynasty.
He understands that the very second a North Korean nuclear missile launches, the U.S. response would turn Pyongyang to glass and end his regime permanently.
Exactly. Kim is a rational actor within the framework of self-preservation. He holds the match, but he doesn't want to burn.
Then he pivots to Iran. Cruz argues that Iran's leadership operates on a fundamentally different psychological plane because of religious extremism.
He describes the Ayatollah as a theocratic zealot who embraces a death cult theology that venerates martyrdom.
He argues that ordinary cost-benefit analysis doesn't work with a leader who believes dying in a holy war is the ultimate victory.
And his specific fear is that if the Ayatollah acquired a nuclear weapon, The standard rules of MAD wouldn't apply at all.
Cruz posits a chilling theory here. He thinks the Ayatollah might be perfectly willing to sacrifice the entirety of Iran, accepting the inevitable U.S. retaliatory strike if it meant he got to detonate a nuclear weapon in Tel Aviv, New York, or Los Angeles first.
He suggests that, with religious zealotry, national suicide might be viewed as an acceptable, even glorious trade-off for killing millions of perceived infidels.
But is that psychological assessment actually accurate? I mean, is it possible Iran wants nuclear weapons for the exact same reason North Korea does? Just to deter American and Israeli aggression?
It's a vital counterargument, and the interviewer actually raises it. They suggest Iran wants nukes to prevent the very airstrikes they are currently enduring.
Right. If you look at a map, Iran is surrounded by U.S. military bases. Wouldn't a nuke just be the ultimate insurance policy against the exact regime change Cruz is constantly advocating for?
But Cruz vehemently rejects this framing. He says America is not an imperial, expansive regime seeking conquest. We only deploy force when people are actively trying to kill Americans.
He points to the Ayatollah's frequent chants of death to America and argues it isn't just empty political theater for a domestic audience.
Right. It is a stated theological goal they've actively funded through terrorism for decades.
He also dispels a comforting myth a lot of people hold regarding nuclear delivery systems. We tend to think, well, even if they enrich enough uranium for a bomb, they don't have an ICBM, an intercontinental ballistic missile capable of reaching the United States across the ocean, so we're safe.
And Cruz just shatters that comfort.
Completely. He says, first of all, they already have missiles capable of hitting Israel and our European allies.
And second, if you want to hit the American homeland, you don't need a billion-dollar ICBM program.
No, you just need to put a crude nuclear warhead inside a standard shipping container.
Load it onto a commercial freighter under a shell corporation and sail it right into the port of Manhattan, Los Angeles, or London.
Millions of these containers arrive uninspected every year.
That is the terror of asymmetric deterrence. When you are dealing with a state actor that you believe actively welcomes martyrdom, the matches and gasoline metaphor breaks down entirely.
Iran's leadership, in Cruz's assessment, is like a man who wants to set himself on fire to guarantee his place in paradise, so long as he takes you with him.
The threat of retaliation no longer works as a deterrent, and this psychological assessment is the foundational rationale Cruz uses to justify preemptive, overwhelming military force.
If you believe deterrence is literally impossible, then prevention at all costs, even war, becomes the only logical path to survival.
He also mentions a deeply pragmatic, tactical reason the administration was striking right then.
Oh, right, the missile stockpile.
Yeah. Iran was rapidly mass-producing a massive stockpile of short and medium-range missiles. They were churning out over 100 a month.
The strategic fear was that they were building a conventional shield so thick, so capable of sinking U.S. aircraft carriers or destroying regional bases, that eventually going in to stop their nuclear program would cause too massive a loss of American life.
The window to act was closing. They had to strike now, before that conventional shield became impenetrable.
But the pressure placed on Iran doesn't just happen in a vacuum, right? We live in a deeply interconnected, complex global ecosystem.
We do. And Cruz argues that collapsing the regime in Tehran would have massive, immediate ripple effects on autocracies on the completely opposite side of the planet.
The geopolitical domino effect. He makes a staggering prediction here. He says there's a very real possibility that within 6 months of intense pressure, we could see new governments in Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba.
He says if that happens, it would be the biggest, most positive geopolitical shift for human freedom since the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
To understand why he explicitly links these three specific countries, which, are separated by oceans and cultures, we have to map out what we can call the economic pipeline of tyranny.
It's a fascinating look at how heavily sanctioned pariah states survive by creating a barter system to prop each other up.
Let's trace that pipeline. He points out that for the first 4 decades of Castro's communist rule, Cuba was essentially a wholly owned subsidiary of the Soviet Union.
The USSR pumped massive amounts of money and energy into Cuba to maintain a foothold just 90 miles from Florida.
But when the Cold War ended and the USSR collapsed in the early 90s, the money stopped. Cuba was suddenly broke and starving, so they needed a new patron.
And they found one in Venezuela.
Cruz calls it a Faustian bargain. Venezuela, incredibly rich with oil revenue under Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, agreed to provide Cuba with a massive daily supply of oil and hard currency.
But Cuba didn't have money to pay for it.
No. But what Cuba did have, after decades of perfecting the mechanics of an authoritarian police state, was expertise in oppression.
So in exchange for oil, Cuba exported intelligence officers, military advisors, and thugs to structure Maduro's secret police.
They taught the Venezuelan government how to crush dissent, spy on their citizens, and turn a prosperous democracy into a socialist dictatorship.
Cruz notes that when the U.S. moved against Maduro, he was literally being guarded by a ring of elite Cuban military soldiers because he couldn't even trust his own people.
So how does the U.S. break this symbiotic cycle? Cruz details the pressure campaign. The U.S. targets the source of the wealth.
Right. They heavily sanction and isolate Maduro, which essentially severs the lifeline of oil tankers flowing from Venezuela to Havana.
For a brief moment, Mexico's leftist government tried to step in and provide oil to Cuba, but President Trump leaned heavily on Mexico, threatening economic consequences to force them to cut it off.
And the result of cutting off that pipeline, Cruz says the Cuban economy went into absolute immediate freefall.
The government had to shut down public transportation across the island because they literally ran out of diesel. They ran out of jet fuel.
The economic crisis became so severe that the facade of communist utopia began cracking wide open.
To really illustrate the human toll of this collapsing system, Cruz shares a deeply poignant story from his Aunt Sonia, the same aunt who was tortured by Castro's regime.
Yeah, she went back to visit Cuba years later and met with a friend from high school.
This friend was now a mid-level Communist Party apparatchik. He had a big, mandatory portrait of Fidel Castro hanging proudly over his living room sofa.
But when Sonia arrives, he takes her into the kitchen, tightly closes the drapes so no neighbors or informants can see them, and he just bursts into tears.
It is a devastating anecdote about the psychology of living under a totalitarian regime. The man looks at Sonia and her daughter, who live freely in the United States, and he weeps over his own cowardice.
He tells her he knew the system was a lie, but he was too afraid to try and escape on a raft.
And as a result of his cowardice, he has consigned his own children to a life of misery, surveillance, and poverty.
And then, after 10 minutes of crying in the kitchen, he washes his face, puts his artificial smile back on, opens the drapes, and goes back to projecting the image of a happy, loyal party member.
Cruz argues that quiet desperation is happening in millions of kitchens across Cuba right now, and the economic pressure from severing the Venezuelan oil is forcing that desperation into the streets.
So if we look at this like pulling a block out of a Jenga tower, you pull the oil out of Venezuela and the Cuban tower wobbles violently, we have to ask, is Cruz being overly optimistic about what happens when the tower falls?
He suggests that if the communist regime collapses, Cuba could rapidly become the Hong Kong of the 1990s, an oasis of free enterprise fueled by billions of dollars in investments from wealthy Cuban Americans in Miami.
But does the economic collapse of a dictatorship automatically lead to a thriving, peaceful, free market?
History strongly suggests it does not. The transition from a collapsed autocracy to a functional democracy is incredibly violent and chaotic.
Even Cruz himself acknowledges Cuba has a 6-decade-old machinery of repression. The secret police, the military, the informants, they don't just vaporize when the economy tanks.
No, desperate regimes facing existential threats usually don't surrender. They order the military to open fire on the crowds. They clamp down significantly harder before they break, leading to prolonged suffering and potential civil war.
And there are ripple effects for Americans, too. When the interviewer points out that heavily sanctioning Iran or Venezuela or blockading the Strait of Hormuz causes huge spikes in global oil prices, Cruz dismisses the long-term danger.
And when he dismisses that, he's talking about the price you, the listener, pay at the pump. He acknowledges it's politically dangerous for a politician to cause $6 a gallon gas during an election year.
But he is betting that you enduring economic pain in the short term is a worthwhile trade-off.
He believes a completely free Iran and a free Venezuela, eventually bringing their massive sanctions-free oil reserves back to the global market, would ultimately lower global energy prices permanently.
So he sees defeating Iran as the linchpin to a cascading series of victories for the U.S. economy and global security.
But this aggressively uncompromising stance against Iran inherently ties the United States incredibly tightly to another nation in the region, Israel.
And this brings us to one of the most surprising, fiery, and frankly explosive parts of the source material. We see a sitting politician ruthlessly attacking massive elements of his own political wing.
Before he gets to the domestic critique, he first lays out the pragmatic, non-ideological defense of the U.S.-Israel military alliance.
He argues it isn't just about shared religious values or historical guilt. He says it is unequivocally in America's raw national security interest.
Israel is a stable, free-market democracy in a chaotic region, and crucially, their intelligence apparatus, the Mossad, is arguably the most effective in the world at infiltrating terror networks.
And they share that vital data directly with the CIA to stop attacks on Americans.
He highlights a recent conflict he refers to as the 12-Day War to illustrate this military symbiosis. He details how Israel systematically assassinated IRGC leaders in Syria and Lebanon with such a staggering speed and precision that Iranian officers literally started refusing promotions.
Because taking the job was a death sentence. They'd take out a commander, Tehran would appoint a replacement the next day, and Israeli intelligence would track him and eliminate him too.
But he notes Israel has limitations, and that is where the U.S. steps in. The Iranians deliberately built their most sensitive nuclear enrichment facilities deep inside the base of a solid rock mountain at Fordo.
They built it there specifically because they calculated that standard Israeli munitions were not large enough to penetrate that much granite.
The only country on Earth with bombs capable of destroying it was the United States.
Exactly. To explain the mechanics of this, you cannot just drop a regular explosive on a mountain. You need a massive ordnance penetrator, commonly called bunker buster.
These are 30,000-pound bombs made of hardened steel cases.
They don't explode on impact. They use sheer kinetic energy to smash through dozens of feet of solid rock or reinforced concrete, and a delayed fuse detonates the massive explosive payload only after it has penetrated the subterranean facility.
Only the US B-2 stealth bombers can deliver them effectively. Cruz views this as a perfect partnership. Israel provides the localized intelligence and ground-level disruption, and the U.S. provides the overwhelming specialized hammer when necessary.
But the conversation abruptly shifts from the Middle East to how this alliance is viewed domestically, and Cruz goes on the offensive.
He starts by heavily criticizing the political left for what he sees as a rising tide of anti-Semitism on college campuses and in progressive politics.
He attributes this to a Marxist oppressor versus oppressed matrix.
The interviewer agrees, framing it as a worldview where darker-skinned, militarily weaker groups are automatically designated as the morally righteous oppressed, and stronger, Western-aligned, successful nations like Israel are automatically cast as the evil oppressors, regardless of context or history.
Cruz calls it a green-red alliance, where Marxists and radical Islamists inexplicably team up because they share a common enemy.
That critique of left-wing ideology is standard fare for a conservative politician. What is totally unexpected is what comes next.
He pivots and launches a blistering, highly specific, almost unprecedented attack on his own side of the political aisle.
He singles out Tucker Carlson, calling him the most dangerous demagogue in America.
It is genuinely jarring. You do not often hear a conservative senator go on a popular show and utterly unload on one of the most influential conservative media figures in the world, a man who dictates the populist agenda for millions of voters.
He accuses Carlson of being pathologically obsessed with hating Israel and attacking Jews on a daily basis.
And he brings specific receipts to back up his claim. Cruz details a pattern of behavior that alarms him.
He mentions Carlson hosting a crackpot historian who spent an entire interview claiming Winston Churchill, not Adolf Hitler, was the actual villain of World War II.
He mentions Carlson highlighting a professor who seriously suggested the U.S. should have backed the Nazis against the Soviets.
He brings up Carlson's decision to interview Nick Fuentes. Cruz points out that Fuentes is a notorious white nationalist who has openly stated he agrees with Hitler, and that Fuentes explicitly told Carlson his political mission was to defeat global Jewry, meaning Jewish people everywhere, not just the geopolitical state of Israel.
And Cruz claims Carlson just nodded along sympathetically.
He also calls out Carlson for defending the president of Iran in a fawning interview, while simultaneously stating he hates Christian Zionists in America.
So what does this civil war tell us about the current state of American politics? It feels like the traditional post-WWII foreign policy consensus, the idea that politics stops at the water's edge and we universally oppose tyrants, is fracturing entirely.
It reveals a profound, potentially permanent realignment. Cruz is fighting a desperate multi-front war here. Globally, he is trying to legislate pressure against autocratic regimes in Tehran and Havana.
But domestically, he is fighting a rising isolationist populist wing within his own party, a wing that he believes flirts with anti-Americanism, revisionist history, and outright anti-Semitism, simply as a form of contrarianism and audience engagement.
He explicitly states his ultimate nightmare scenario. He fears waking up in 5 years to find that both major U.S. political parties have become viciously anti-Israel and completely isolationist.
He is trying to purge what the interviewer calls a mind virus before it fully consumes the conservative movement.
It's a stark warning about the decay of our domestic political landscape. But as tense as the situation is with Iran's nuclear program, and as fractured as our domestic politics are, Cruz reveals a conversation that shifts the anxiety entirely away from traditional battlefields, away from the Middle East, and into a much darker, much more modern realm.
We are moving from the physics of bunker busters dropping on mountains to the microscopic terror of the laboratory.
This brings us to his conversation with Palmer Luckey. Luckey is a major tech entrepreneur, originally in virtual reality, who now runs a massive defense technology company.
Cruz compares Lucky to Elon Musk, saying that neither of them just thinks outside the box. Their brains are wired such that they don't even realize a box exists.
They are completely unconstrained, lateral thinkers analyzing the future of warfare. Cruz says he had lunch with Luckey and asked him a simple, terrifying question. What does the future of military conflict look like in 10 years? If you were an enemy who wanted to destroy the United States, how would you do it?
And Lucky's answer was highly counterintuitive. He dismissed the immediate apocalyptic threat of drone swarms and artificial intelligence.
He argued their development for actual, reliable kinetic warfare is moving much slower than the media portrays, and that legacy manned aircraft like B-2 bombers and F-35 fighters will likely remain the primary tools of force projection for decades.
Instead, the real, wildly under-discussed apocalyptic threat they focused on was bioweapons.
Exactly. Luckey pointed out the massive, glaring vulnerability of the United States to biological attacks. We just lived through a global proof of concept with the COVID-19 pandemic.
As Cruz notes, COVID had a relatively low mortality rate compared to known weaponized pathogens like anthrax or Marburg.
Yet that single virus completely shut down the global economy for a year, disrupted supply chains, caused massive social division, and inflicted trillions of dollars in damage.
Cruz argues COVID was likely the result of an accidental leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, where scientists were conducting gain-of-function research.
When they say gain of function, picture a laboratory where scientists are intentionally putting a virus through an evolutionary boot camp. They are artificially speeding up mutations to teach the virus how to infect human cells faster and bypass our immune systems, supposedly so we can study it and create vaccines before nature mutates it naturally.
Cruz argues that creating these superviruses, even for study, is playing with fire.
But the terrifying prospect Luckey raised goes far beyond an accidental leak of a respiratory virus. They discuss the rapidly advancing ability to actively bioengineer a pathogen.
Not just a general plague that kills randomly, but a virus specifically tailored to target specific genetic markers.
They are talking about engineering a virus that only infects specific races, specific ethnic groups, or even specific family bloodlines, while leaving the rest of the population completely unharmed.
Cruz connects this dark technological horizon right back to his earlier psychological assessment of the Iranian regime's zealotry.
He asks the ultimate chilling question. If the Ayatollah had a bioengineered virus that only killed Jews or only killed Westerners, wouldn't he be eager to release it?
If he is willing to risk nuclear retaliation, he would certainly release a silent virus.
And the most dangerous part is the democratization of this destruction. A hostile state actor with trillions of dollars and massive laboratories is incredibly dangerous.
But the underlying CRISPR technology and gene editing tools are becoming so cheap, so accessible, and so widely understood that soon it won't require a nation-state.
Cruz paints a picture of a small cell of radicalized terrorists operating in a rented warehouse with mail-order DNA synthesizers, bioengineering a plague that could kill tens of millions of people.
This completely short-circuits everything we've talked about for the last hour.
Traditional warfare, even against a rogue state like Iran or a dictator like Castro, is like a heavyweight boxing match. You can see the opponent. You can measure their reach. You can count their tanks, track their drones, and target their missile silos. You know exactly who to hit back.
And that visibility, that attribution, is the entire foundational premise of the non-interventionist Hawk strategy.
That strategy relies on peace through strength. It relies on deterrence. It relies on the enemy knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt that if they strike American citizens, the U.S. military will find them and obliterate them.
But bioweapons turn warfare into a ghost story. How on earth does a peace-through-strength deterrence model work when a deadly virus starts spreading through the subway system and you literally don't know who released it?
If a non-state actor in a basement in Eastern Europe unleashes a genetically targeted pathogen, there is no capital city to bomb. There is no IRGC headquarters to decapitate with a bunker buster.
The entire concept of mutually assured destruction becomes obsolete. You cannot threaten overwhelming retaliation if you cannot find the enemy.
That is the most profound flaw in the geopolitical framework Cruz has built. His worldview, rooted in his family's physical trauma in the Cuban jungles, refined by the kinetic failures of the Iraq War, and aimed squarely at collapsing physical regimes like Iran, is designed entirely for a physical world.
A 20th century world of nation-states, borders, and conventional militaries. But the technological future Palmer Luckey describes is asymmetric, invisible, and potentially entirely untraceable.
It is a sobering place to end our analysis of this worldview. We have covered an incredible amount of philosophical and tactical ground today.
We started with the visceral story of a 14-year-old boy fighting a corrupt dictator in Cuba, completely unaware of the communist ideology that would soon torture his own sister.
We traced how that dual trauma forged Cruz's absolute, uncompromising hatred of tyranny and his view of global politics as a gladiator's coliseum.
We examined the cold, unsentimental calculus of the non-interventionist Hawk, a philosophy that rejected the utopian nation-building of the Iraq War, yet fully embraced the use of B-2 bombers to systematically decapitate the Iranian military, driven solely by the metric of protecting American lives.
We explored the terrifying psychology of asymmetric deterrence, the belief that an adversary might welcome their own nuclear annihilation if it meant destroying their enemies.
We looked at the geopolitical domino effect, the strategic hope that starving the Venezuelan oil pipeline could finally collapse the 6-decade-old communist regime in Cuba.
We analyzed the bitter domestic fracture, with Cruz warning that a populist mind virus of anti-Semitism and isolationism is threatening to consume his own political party.
And finally, we stared into the abyss of the future, the threat of genetically targeted bioweapons engineered in a warehouse by people who leave no return address.
To synthesize all of this, to summarize Cruz's ultimate belief in the power of American ideology to overcome even the darkest threats, the interview ends with a historical story about Ronald Reagan.
It's the perfect thematic bow. Cruz talks about a painting he keeps of Ronald Reagan standing at the Brandenburg Gate in West Berlin, delivering the famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall."
Cruz reveals that the State Department actually crossed that specific sentence out of the speech drafts 3 separate times. The diplomatic experts told Reagan it was too provocative, too bellicose, and above all, completely unrealistic.
They believed the Soviet Union was permanent, and the Berlin Wall would stand until the end of time.
And Reagan wrote it back in every single time with his own pen, telling his advisors that's the whole point of the speech. Less than 3 years later, the wall fell, and the Soviet Union soon followed.
Cruz emphasizes that the wall wasn't bulldozed by American tanks. It wasn't destroyed by American missiles. It was torn down by the sheer power of American ideological leadership, the power of speaking truth to totalitarianism, and the courage to stand unyieldingly against tyranny without firing a shot.
It is a powerful, triumphant image of ideological victory, but it leaves us with a final provocative thought to mull over. In the 1980s, a strong ideological speech, backed by a massive conventional military, could help topple a heavily armed, bureaucratic Soviet empire. But as we look toward the future, Palmer Luckey described a terrifying future of untraceable bioweapons, rogue actors in basements, and invisible asymmetric threats. Will the clarity of our ideology, or even the sheer kinetic strength of our bunker busters, be enough to protect us against an enemy we can't even see?
It is the defining, unresolved security question of the next century.
Think about that the next time you read a headline about global security or a new virus strain. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope our forensic analysis helped unpack the complex, often hidden logic behind these major geopolitical decisions. Keep questioning the world around you, and we will see you next time.